Hello and welcome. These audio recordings are designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam, and we'll go over some of the more common Part C questions found on Paper 1. You may find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, or you might just want to listen through as part of your revision. That's okay too. Today we will be looking at a question that students seem to love seeing on the exam paper, and it does come up very regularly. Was the Treaty of Versailles fair? Many of you will be familiar by now with what us history teachers call PEE. That is to say, you make a point, back it up with evidence. This might be in the form of names, dates, statistics, quotations, people, places and events, and then explain. Phrases such as "this shows" or "this suggests" are helpful in achieving this, and better answers will often give more than one layer of explanation. We call this PE 2.0 because you're doing it twice. So, in this response, we will use the PEE formula. So, let's get started. Was the Treaty of Versailles fair? This response will offer a 7-point scope. 3 reasons suggesting that it was fair, and 4 reasons suggesting it was not fair. Remember, it's always crucial to give 2 sides of an argument before arriving at a clever conclusion. Okay, first side. Let's argue that the treaty was fair. Point 1. Germany had caused great damage in the war and somebody had to pay for it. Evidence to support this could include: in the town of Ypres in Belgium, not a single building was left standing after 4 years of terrible warfare and some of the worst fighting mankind has ever known at Hellfire Corner. Moreover, French farmland and industry had been halted by the war, and there was a loss of working population and a skewing of the European sex ratio. After all, millions had died in this conflict. And so in explaining our first point, you may argue, well, Germany had caused great physical and economic damage to Europe, and so it was only fair that she was made to pay, and to pay harshly. Point 2. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Evidence to support this includes: at Brest-Litovsk, when Russia had dropped out of the war, Germany had demanded extremely harsh terms. She demanded, for example, that the Russians concede 34% of its enormous population, 32% of its agricultural land, 54% of its industry, over a quarter, 26% of its railways, and a whopping 89% of its coal mines. In fact, the peace was so harsh that Trotsky famously walked out of the proceedings. And so, in explaining our second point, we could argue, well, Germany didn't have a right to expect a fair settlement after the harsh peace they had imposed upon Russia at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Point 3. The need for revenge. Evidence to support this point includes: now we must remember that Germany had effectively invaded France in 1870 as well as in 1914, and many people wanted revenge. They also saw a need to crush Germany militarily. As so, The German army was reduced to 100,000, conscription was banned, they were not allowed any armoured vehicles, submarines or aircraft, and only 6 battleships were allowed, the rest being scuttled off Scapa Flow. The Rhineland was demilitarised, and Germany was forbidden from having an Anschluss with Austria. So again, in explaining this evidence, we may argue that there was a need for military reasons to really crush Germany to try and make a lasting peace, as well as to get revenge. Okay, time for the magic words. On the other hand. We're now going to give 4 PEs to explain how the treaty might not be seen to be fair. Point 1. It led to enormous levels of resentment, and many argue World War II. Evidence to support this includes: most Germans regarded the treaty as a diktat, and those who signed it, such as the socialist Gustav Bauer, the November criminals. President Wilson himself said if he were a German, he would not sign it, and Lloyd George later described it as a, quote, great pity, unquote. So Germany was forced to sign, and in explaining this, you may wish to argue that it led to unfair levels of resentment and sowed the seeds for World War II, and so in that sense, it was not a justified or fair treaty. Point 2. The 14 points. Many Germans would have expected a fairer peace because of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Evidence to support this includes: Woodrow Wilson was seen by many as an idealist, and his 14 points were published in January 1918. That is to say, before the Treaty of Versailles, the 14th of which was the establishment of the League of Nations. But many of these points were not put in place, such as the 10th, self-determination, because they impacted upon the interests of imperial powers such as Britain and France. And so in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that many Germans would have seen the 14 points as being the document that would underpin the peace settlement. Point 3. Double standards. Evidence to support this claim include: well, it could be argued that Germany was not the only one to cause the war. After all, Britain had been growing militarily. It had 64 submarines compared to Germany's 23, and 122 warships compared to Germany's 85, including the Dreadnought, at the time that war began. Moreover, Britain had alliances with the Triple Entente in 1907, and Britain was certainly imperialistic, at one point ruling 2/3 of the world's land surface. And finally, Britain was certainly nationalistic in 1914, as seen by the euphoria at the outbreak of war. So if we cover the 4 main causes of war, militarism, alliances, imperialism and nationalism, there's certainly an argument that it wasn't just Germany's fault. And so Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, the so-called War Guilt Clause, did seem very unfair to many Germans, and it helped fuel the stab-in-the-back myth or Dolchstoss theory. Historian L.C.F. Turner says, quote, "None of the rulers of the great powers really knew what they were fighting about," unquote. And so in explaining point 3, you may wish to argue that there were some double standards at the peace treaty, because Germany can be seen to be not exclusively to blame for World War I. Point 4. Our final point is that the treaty led to economic and political instability in Germany, and that the Big Four should have foreseen this. Evidence to support this includes: we know that we have the Kapp Putsch, the Munich Putsch, the Spartacist Uprising, all taking place in the aftermath of Versailles. Reparations of £6.6 billion UK were unaffordable in many eyes and led to the French and Belgian invasion of the Ruhr, passive resistance, and the ensuing hyperinflation of 1923. Historian Detlef Peukert describes the Treaty of Versailles, therefore, as, quote, a millstone around the new German Republic's neck, unquote. Economically, the loss of 10% of its land, 12.5% of its population, 16% of its coalfields, and 50% of its iron and steel industry meant that reparations were even harder to pay back. And so in explaining this point, you may argue that the Treaty of Versailles was not fair because it gave the Weimar Republic, this new noble experiment in German democracy, very little chance of surviving. So let's recap. Was the Treaty of Versailles fair? We have argued that on the one hand, the treaty was fair because somebody had to pay for the damage. Germany had imposed harsh penalties on Russia at Brest-Litovsk, and there was a need for revenge and to crush the German military threat. On the other hand, we have argued some people believe it led to resentment and World War II. It wasn't really in line with Wilson's 14 points, and so the Germans might have been expecting a better deal. There is an argument that there were some double standards involved, particularly with the war guilt clause, because Germany can be argued to be not just the only nation to have caused the war. And finally, it led to economic and political instability in Germany. So, now it's time to tie it all together with a clever conclusion. A British diplomat who was at Versailles, Harold Nicholson, wrote in his memoirs that the treaty was, quote, neither just nor wise, unquote. However, many at the time did see it as justifiable, and some saw it as too soft. Although with hindsight it is easy for us to comment that it caused World War II, the sheer facts and figures of German demands at Brest-Litovsk suggest to me that at the time it was a justifiable treaty in the context of the era. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. If you did, feel free to follow me at Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or if you prefer, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye!